Last meeting, pinag-usapan natin yung pinagkaiba ng mga different forms of psychological test. If you remember, merong mga psychological test na IQ test, there are personality test, meron din tayong tinatawag na performance test at marami pang iba. So that is only one way that psychological tests may be different from each other. Pero meron pang isang paraan how psychological tests are different from each other. This time, pag-uusapan natin the types of psychological tests according to how we administer those tests. Dalawang klase lang naman yan. Meron tayong tinatawag na individual test and group test. Pag sinabi mong individual test, ito yung mga psychological tests that are designed to be administered on a one-on-one setup. Some examples would be yung Rorschach, at karamihan ng mga projective tests are all individual tests. Stanford Binet and Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. Again, let me repeat, for this test, kaya siya tinawag na individual test, they are designed to be administered on a one-on-one setup. Nandoon lang yung examiner, andun lang yung examinee. On the other hand, group tests naman are tests that are designed na pwede mong i-administer sa grupo ng mga tao. So, pwedeng maraming test taker, isa ang examiner. So, that's the setup of group test. Karamihan ng mga personality tests are considered group tests because, again, you can administer such tests to a large group of individuals all at the same time. Some examples would be yung NeoPyR, ALSAT, at marami pang ibang mga group tests. So that's the main difference between individual and group tests. Now, before we further discuss the differences among or between these two tests, bibigyan ko muna kayo ng mga cases, and then from here, i-discuss natin yung mga key characteristics or key differences ng mga features ng individual versus group test. Let's start with case number 1. A boy named Kyle went into your office to take the ALSAT, a kind of group intelligence test. You hesitated to give him the test. Bakit? Kasi nakalagay sa manual yung ALSAT ay isang group test, which means it has to be taken in groups. Now, the question is, should you allow Kyle to take the test or not? So, yung ALSAT is an example of a test under group test. Ang problema dito, si Kyle, mag-isa lang siya nakukuha nung test. Question, should you give Kyle the test na mag-isa lang siya even if the ALSAT is a group test? The correct answer here is okay lang. So even if Kyle is just alone and you are going to administer ALSAT, which is a group test, that is totally fine. Because the first key difference between group and individual tests is in terms of flexibility. Yung mga group tests, mas flexible siya kumpara sa mga individual tests. In what way? Ang group test, pwede mo pa rin siyang i-administer ng one-on-one. So, pwede siyang grupo, sabay-sabay. You can also administer this on a one-on-one setup. But individual tests are not like this. Very strict ang individual test. Pag individual test yan, dapat one-on-one talaga ang administration dyan. Hindi mo pwedeng ipilit na dalawa at the same time, tatlo at the same time, lalong-lalo na 40 at the same time. Strictly one-to-one setup for individual tests. That's why, again, let me just emphasize this. When you give someone a test, a psychological test under individual test, it looks something like this. One-on-one talaga yan. Nandyan lang yung examiner, nandyan lang yung examinee. That's why for most clinics or even universities na nag-administer ng individual test, you need a specific place for this. Kinakailangan meron kang room, a small room, that is designed for the administration of individual tests. Sa DLSU, meron yan. Ang tawag namin dyan ay mga dyads, no? So in these rooms are specially designed for the administration of individual tests. Pero kapag group test naman ang i-administer mo, you don't need these small rooms. It would work for big rooms. Because again, group test, you can give that test to many people all at the same time. Let's move on to case number 2. Sabi dito, You are the assistant of a big-time assessment psychologist, Dr. Kelly. It is Tuesday, the day where your boss will check the intelligence test he has given the previous week. He called you outside and instructed you to prepare the stencil answer key of an intelligence test. Given this, would you assume that he will be checking a group test, individual test, or you can't say? So, ang problema natin dito, pinapakuha ka ng stencil. Huhulaan mo ngayon. Dahil yung gagamitin ni Dr. Kelly ay gumagamit ng stencil, would you assume that the test that Dr. Kelly administered is a group test, individual test, or hindi natin masabi? The correct answer here is, well, the key information for us to answer this, you are going to prepare a stencil answer key for this test. Kapag ikaw ay gagamit ng stencil answer key, most likely, ang ginamit dyan ay isang klase ng group test. The second difference between individual and group test, the nature of items. Magkaiba yung klase ng items na binibigay for individual test versus group test. Karamihan ng mga items sa group test are called closed-ended questions, meaning you have a question to answer, but you are also given choices to answer. There is only one answer, one correct answer to a question. Kaya nga papasok dito yung multiple choice, no, na items. Under yan ng closed-ended questions. In multiple choice items, you are given a question and there are choices. And there is only one answer for that question. There is only one correct choice for that question. In this case, what part of the brain initiates puberty? Ang sagot, letter B, pituitary gland. This is a close-ended question because there is only one correct answer for one item. Kaya mo kinakailangan ng stencil. If you are not familiar with what stencil is, ito yung ginagamit natin to score responses of a test taker na kumuha ng isang group intelligence test. Sa stencil na yon, usually parang ganito siya, oh. Ito. Tapos butas-butas 'yan. Itatapat mo yung stencil, yung mga may butas na 'yan doon sa answer sheet na sinagutan ng test taker, and then if the response of the test taker is in line with the hole in the stencil, ibig sabihin tama yung sagot niya. Yan yung sinaunang paraan on how to check group intelligence tests. No, in fact, ginamit yan noong World War I. If you still remember the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, merong stencil answer key yun. And remember, the Army Alpha and Army Beta are examples of group intelligence test. Pero ngayon, syempre, fast forward, technological na tayo, hindi na masyadong uso ang nagche-check manually. We are no longer using stencils that much because we are now using machines to check the responses of the test takers. Ito yung tinatawag nating machine scoring or scantron scoring, no? So, hindi na natin ginagamit yung ating mga kamay o yung stencil to check. Only the computers can do this. So, yan na yun yung evolution, no? Yan yung technology of today in checking modern day psychological tests. Now, going to individual test items, open-ended naman yung mga tanong dito. Ibig sabihin ng open-ended, items in individual test, meron siyang range of possible answers. Wala siyang iisang eksaktong tama o maling sagot compared to close-ended questions. Most items from individual tests that measures intelligence is like this. For example, para malinaw, in ways, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, kapag itetest niya yung vocabulary mo, hindi ka naman niya bibigyan ng multiple choice items para masukat yung vocabulary mo. You will be the one to define yourself what is the meaning of the following words. So, imagine me, I'm the examiner and you are the examinee. You can just pause the video. I want you to define the word terminate in your own words. Define the word confide in your own words. Define the word usurp in your own words. So habang dinidefine mo yan, sinusulat ko as the examiner yung mga naririnig kong sagot mo, and then from there, later on, after the test, I am going to score each items according to what you said, according to your own definition. question, how do we score this? Kasi wala naman tayong stencil dito because this is an open-ended question. Wala siyang choices. Napipiliin ka lang, no? Ikaw mismo ang magde-define. So how do we score this? This is where the manual enters the picture. Kapag bubuksan mo yung manual ng Wechsler in the vocabulary department, the manual will already anticipate ranges of possible answers. So kapag yung mga sagot mo ay for example mga ganito, okay, you give that person 2 points. Kapag yung mga response naman niya more or less mga ganito, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever that is, I'm going to give you 1 point. Kapag ang sagot mo naman sobrang layo at talagang wala o hindi siya tama, ang makukuha mo is 0 points. The same thing that we do in comprehension still in Wechsler. So sa comprehension naman, para masukat natin yan, you will be asked questions. Everyday questions that you need to answer verbally. Again, no choices here. This is not multiple choice format. So I'm going to ask you, for example, I'm the examiner, why do people need to wear watches? Why most of the foods need to be cooked? How is a boat and automobile similar? So hindi ka bibigyan ng mga choices dito at bibilugan mo yung tamang sagot. You will be the one to answer these questions in your own words. Ang tawag dito, again, open-ended questions. Most questions coming from individual tests are like this. And again, sa mga nagtatanong, paano na naman natin i-scorean to? Remember, we don't have stencils here. There is no single correct answer here. Unlike in multiple choice, ganun ulit yung gagawin natin. I am going to get the manual of Wechsler, go to that department or go to that part, no, the comprehension part, and the manual will anticipate possible answers coming from the test taker. So ilang points yung makukuha mo depende kung saan pumapasok na category yung sinagot mo for that question. Pumasok ba siya doon sa mga sagot na pang 2 points, mga sagot na pang 1 point, o mga sagot na pang 0 point? So that's how nature in individual test differs from group test. Let's move on to case number 3. Dr. Skinner owns a psychological clinic that administers only individual tests. He is looking for 2 personnel to work for the clinic. There are 2 applicants. One has a master's degree in DevPsych and a licensed psychometrician. The other has a master's degree in psychological testing and a licensed psychometrician. So ang tanong dito, can Dr. Skinner hire both or just choose one from these 2? Kasi ang kailangan ni Skinner, dalawa. Tamang-tama, dalawa yung aplikante. So ang tanong dito, given the competence, given the background of these people who are applying for his clinic, pwede ba niyang kunin yung dalawang yan? Ang tamang sagot dito is, pwede naman. Given the nature of the work, given the company of Dr. Skinner, and given the background of these applicants, Dr. Skinner can hire them both. Pero, meron tayong mga considerations, no, na dapat gagawin even if we hire them both. Pag-usapan natin yan as we talk about the third difference between individual and group tests. Magkaiba sila ng requirement in examiner competency. Usually, or madalas, individual tests will require higher competence, higher sets of skills compared to group tests. Kumbaga, mas mataas yung standard, mas maraming hinahanap, no, coming from a person who will be administering individual test compared to a person who will be administering group test. Kasi kapag ang i-administer group test, simple lang naman yung mga requirements dyan for you to be qualified as an examiner. Usually, ang kailangan lang naman dyan, syempre, lisensyado ka, nakakasulat at basa ka, at marunong kang mag-keep ng accurate time. Marunong kang gumamit ng stopwatch, especially when the tests that you are going to administer are timed tests. Ganyan kasimple pag group test. Pero kapag individual test kasi, may marami sa kanila more than just this. You need to have more than these qualifications to be allowed as an examiner of an individual test. Halimbawa, yung Stanford Binet. Ano ba yung mga requirements sa isang tao, sa isang psychometrician para maging para magkaroon siya ng karapatan to administer Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. Syempre, psychometrician license. But more than that, kinakailangan mo rin ng training. Kinakailangan mo ng supervision. Dapat meron kang prior experience from administering this test. And hindi lang yon, hindi lang sapat na meron kang prior experience, dapat supervised yung prior experience mo. In fact, in some contexts, in some countries, iba pa yung license mo to be a test administrator, iba pa yung license mo sa paggamit mismo ng Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. So I hope you realize right here that definitely the requirement to be an examiner of individual test is much way higher compared to requirements of being an examiner of group test. Kaya ang implication nito, laging mas mahal talaga kumuha ng isang individual test compared to a group test. You go to psychological clinics, let's say you requested for a group test versus you requested for an individual test, mas mataas ang bill mo. Mas mataas ang babayaran mo if you will be taking individual tests. And I hope you understand why. Number one, syempre yung mga materyales. Mas mahal yung testing kit kapag individual test compared to group test. Number two, ang binabayaran mo sa individual test is not only the answer sheet, binabayaran mo rin yung presensya, yung presence nung examiner, yung competence nung examiner in administering that individual test. So, mas mataas talaga ang bill kapag ikaw ay kukuha ng individual test more than group test. In fact, just to support what I'm saying here, in most programs in clinical psychology, laging meron kang subject where you will be taught individual assessment. For example, in Lasal, kapag ikaw ay nag-masteral dyan sa clinical psychology, no, meron ka talagang subject na pag-aaralan mo all about individual tests. So, bakit meron pang ganyang subject? Because again, handling individual tests requires a lot of competence that you really need to master this if you plan to handle any form of individual test. Merong individual assessment pero walang group assessment. Kasi nga, kapag group assessment, kapag group test ang gagamitin mo, hindi naman ganun kataas yung requirement unlike individual assessment. So you really need to study this subject if you plan to administer any form of individual test. Kaya nga, going back to that case sa pinag-usapan natin kanina, pwede mo namang i-hire yung dalawang aplikante. It's just that, ito, no? Kaya mo sila pwedeng i-hire, pareho naman kasi silang psychometrician eh. So, walang problema. 'Di ba? Yan yung pinaka-entry-level requirement. Merong lisensya to administer standardized psychological test. But Dr. Skinner must train them and supervise them in administering individual tests. Hindi sapat na psychometrician lang sila. Hindi sapat na meron silang lisensya. They need to master the skill of administering, handling individual tests. And I think we can assume that Dr. Skinner has that competence. After all, siya yung owner ng clinic. Nabigyan siya ng business permit, which means his clinic is qualified to handle individual tests because of Dr. Skinner's presence. Diba? Kasi hindi ka naman i-allow na mag-operate ang psychological clinic if you don't have anyone in that clinic who can handle individual tests. So we assume that Dr. Skinner is the one who is qualified to handle individual tests. At tuturuan niya, ite-train ngayon niya, isusupervise niya yung dalawang aplikante na ito. So we can hire them both but they need more training. Let's move on to case number 4. You are a trainee in a testing assessment center. You have two bosses, Dr. Lee and Dr. Freud. Today, the two bosses will be printing their psychological report for their respective clients. Si Dr. Lee used 2 individual tests on his client while Dr. Freud used 2 group intelligence tests for the client. Just before their meeting, both bosses instructed you to put on their table the bond papers they will need to print their assessment report. So, ang tanong dito, kaninong lamesa ka maglalagay ng mas maraming papel na pang-print? Sa mesa ba ni Dr. Lee, ni Dr. Freud, or pareho lang sila ng number of bond paper na dapat matanggap? Well, nakadepende kasi yan, again, yung dami ng papel na ilalagay mo sa kung anong klaseng test yung in-administer sa mga kliyente. Most of the time, you say more things, therefore you need more paper kapag ikaw ay gagamit ng individual test. Diba? Kaya nga ang tamang sagot dito, maglagay ka ng mas maraming papel kay Dr. Lee because he administered 2 individual tests. Assumption, Dr. Lee will report more details compared to Dr. Freud who just administered group test. The fourth key difference between group and individual test, yung analysis of results. Paano tayo mag-analyze ng results? At dito manggagaling syempre yung mga sasabihin natin in the assessment report. Usually when we talk about group test, it's a very simple process. We just get the raw score and then we compare that raw score to the norm written in the manual. And then from there, we interpret. Ganun lang kasimple kapag group test. Checkan mo, kunin mo yung raw score, interpret mo yung raw score using the norm na makikita sa manual. Ano ngayon ang masasabi mo about the client who took that group test. Kaya, ang magandang example dito ng assessment, kapag group test ang ginamit would be something like this. Very straight to the point. John scored 2/10 in a math intelligence test. His score falls on the below average level. That is 1 standard deviation below the mean, according to the norm used. Therefore, we can conclude that John's mathematical skill falls below normal averages. So, ang isang application na pwede mong gawin dito, i-recommend mo si John to take a remedial class for mathematics. But I want you to notice how we interpreted this test. We just got the raw score, compared it to the norm, interpreted the score, and then we write the assessment report. Hindi ganyan kadali kapag ang ginagamit individual test. Yes, we also get the raw score, but more than the raw score, we also add to the assessment report the nonverbal behaviors that we observe from the client while he or she is taking the test. Yun nga yung isang logic bakit one-on-one dapat kapag individual test because hindi ka lang concerned doon sa score na makukuha niya doon sa test, concerned ka rin sa mga proseso, concerned ka rin sa mga observations mo sa kanya, the test taker, while he or she is taking the test. Paano ba sila sumasagot ng test? Ano yung mga strategies na ginagamit nila? Ano yung mga emotions nila habang sinasagot nila yung test? How are they regulating themselves while they are answering the test? Ano yung mga sinasabi nila sa iyo about things while taking the test? Lahat yun. Dapat i-observe mo rin as an examiner of an individual test. Diba? Kaya nga again, taking individual tests or administering individual tests will require more competence from the examiner because you also need to be concerned about these things. Kapag group test talaga, ang concern mo lang dyan yung raw score but not so with individual test. Kaya nga, kapag nagsulat ka ng report using individual test, ang dami mong sasabihin dyan for the assessment. For example, ito yung example ng assessment report from a test taker who took an individual test. Nakita natin yung mga ginawa ni John habang nagtetest. Nag-grumble siya, nagugutom daw siya. We even took note of the strategy that he was using while solving multiplication problems. Gumagamit pa siya ng daliri niya. So again, the point here is, in individual assessment, we go beyond the raw score. Although gusto rin natin malaman kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng raw score, hindi sapat yan sa individual test. Kinakailangan, i-combine natin yan sa ating mga observation from the test taker while he or she is taking the test. Now, some lessons that we can learn here from this short lecture. Number 1, I hope you realize that the handling of group and individual test must be different. Kaya nga sila magkaiba ng category ng psychological test. Iba ang handling, iba ang treatment kapag group test, iba ang handling, iba ang treatment kapag individual test. So, wag nating ititreat na group test ang individual test or individual test ang group test. They are two exclusively different types of psychological tests that needs to be treated differently. Number two, competence is a prerequisite in handling the types of psychological test. Sorry, no, typographical error to. Competence is a prerequisite in handling any type of psychological test. Group testing man yan, individual testing man yan, competence is needed. Hindi lahat pwedeng mag-handle ng psychological test. In fact, that's the point of board exams. Bakit ba tayo nagbo-board exam? Para masigurado natin that people who will be handling psychological tests, especially the standardized psychological test, merong necessary competence to handle the test well. Yan yung point ng lisensya. Para masigurado natin that these standardized psychological tests are in the hands of competent people. People who can handle well those psychological tests that we administer to different people. Kaya nga kung mapapansin ninyo sa psychometrician board exam, bakit mas mabigat yung psychological assessment over theories of personality, abnormal psychology, industrial psychology? 40% or 150 items yung ibibigay sa psychological assessment, tigwa 100 items lang for all the other subjects. The question is, why? Because we want to ensure that people who will be given the license will have the necessary skill set, knows key principles in psychometrics to handle the psychological test the right way. And number three, psychometrician competence is dynamic. Sana matandaan natin to, no, na hindi porket may license ka na, hindi porket naipasa mo na yung board exam, you're done. Remember, the field of psychometrics is constantly evolving. Maraming mga pagbabago ang nangyayari every day, every month, every year. Merong mga bagong psychological test na lumalabas, merong mga bagong techniques na lumalabas, idagdag mo na dyan yung mga pagbabagong nangyayari in our environment. For example, dahil sa pandemya, naging uso ngayon yung online psychological testing. But the way you treat online psychological testing is very different compared to face-to-face psychological testing. Mag-iiba ka ng dynamics dyan. Mag-iiba ka ng approaches dyan. Merong mga bagong techniques na dapat ginagamit kapag online testing. And what are those things? You need to know that. Kaya hindi ka dapat makontento kung meron ka ng lisensya na hanggang doon ka na lang. You need to constantly update. You need to constantly be aware of the trends and developments in the field of psychometrics. And that's the point. This is where PRC enters the picture. Kaya meron tayong CPD system. No? So sana, hindi negative yung tingin natin about this system na kumukuha lang ng pera para kumita. No, I don't think that is true. This system is, the intention of this system is really to ensure that people will be doing, professional psychometricians will be doing their responsibility. Ito ay isang responsibilidad to update our knowledge in correctly handling psychological tests. So, hindi lang yung sistema na yan nandyan para may kumita. No, I don't think so. We need to be responsible enough for ourselves, for our profession, to really update our knowledge para maging effective tayo, in handling psychological test. Sino ba makikinabang kapag meron tayong skills in handling psychological test? Kapag aware tayo sa mga bagong test, kapag aware tayo sa mga bagong strategies, kapag aware tayo sa mga bagong researches, kapag meron tayo mga bagong skills, sino ba makikinabang? Other than us, makikinabang din syempre yung mga clients natin who need our help to understand themselves better. So I hope meron kayong natutunan from this short lecture that we have about the difference between individual test and group test. If you have any questions about this lesson, you can just comment down below and I'm going to do my best to answer all those questions. Salamat sa pakikinig. Until next time, God bless.